Welcome to the webinar, Changemaking and Bilingual Places. And I'm going to pass the microphone over to Chúk. Chúk, who's the Consulting Director of the Impact Evaluation at Tamarack Institute for Learning for the territorial recognition, the land recognition. Before beginning this meeting, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the territory on which I am. And to begin with, I'd like to share a quote from Michael Etherington. Lately, we've been proceeding with symbolic gestures and words. I think right now, many Canadians are beginning to see beyond this rhetoric. If you look at it from a national perspective, there are still important issues related to ancestral lands and the exploitation of natural resources across the country. It's important to remember that the act of recognizing the land was entrusted to us by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The Commission was engaged with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast to understand the reality imposed on them by Canada and the steps we need to take to achieve reconciliation. As expressed in Michael Etherington's quote, land recognition is not just a symbolic gesture, but a declaration of our commitment to the future of our country. With all this in mind, I formulated this land recognition for the town of Fallher, Alberta, because that's where I stand today. Remember, a land acknowledgement is a way of understanding the history of the land we stand on and our connection to it, and therefore our responsibility to it. I encourage you to personalize this land acknowledgement for the place that's closest to your heart. The Indigenous people from the Castar, Cree, and Sekani nations have populated and inhabited the La Rivière-La Paix region since time immemorial. On June 20th, 1899, the local Indigenous people and a representative of the Government of Canada, Chief Commissioner David Laird, signed Treaty 8 at Petit Lac des Esclaves. With many settlers moving south, Bishop Émile Jean-Baptiste Marie Jouard commissioned Father Jean-Baptiste Giroux of Montreal and Father Constant Falreur to attract French-Canadian Catholics to the Peace River. The federal government had surveyed the Peace River region in the early 1900s, and the area was open to settlement in 1912. Father Giroux and Falreur rode horses, and settlers traveled in horse-drawn wagons. And there was a native guide, Payot, who led them, but abandoned them near Winagami. However, the settlers were reunited with their guide, Payot, when Father Giroux took them to visit a native village. They then followed a native trail, an Indigenous trail, and arrived near Peavine Creek, where they rested and ate. The next morning, Sunday, June 2nd, before setting off again, Father Falreur spoke. He said, "My friends, we don't yet know to whom, in the future, these lands will belong. Doesn't it seem to you that, to mark at least the passage of French-Canadian Catholics through this place, it would be appropriate to plant a cross on which the names of all of you would be engraved?" A unanimous yes greeted this proposal. Thus, we see the beginning of Falreur with the names of the original settlers etched forever in history. However, in recording this history, we chose not to keep the names of the traditional custodians of these territories. As a current resident of Falreur, a town named after a Catholic father dabbled with the settlement of these lands, I'd like to pay tribute to the Cree, Daneza, and Denozilini peoples. The town of Falreur was built on Treaty 8 territory, recognizing the sovereignty of these peoples and our obligation to share the land and its resources with them. As people who live and work here, and especially as Francophones, we are all signatories to this treaty of peace and friendship. It is imperative that we follow our leadership of those traditional custodians, of their systems of knowledge, their learning and culture, and emphasize the earth and its well-being. Falreur is also located in Region 6 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I pay tribute to the Métis people, all of them. As with First Nations, Métis people have demanded and continue to demand climate justice, sovereignty, and the right to live with dignity and respect according to their knowledge and cultural systems. We have an obligation to stand by them and support them where we can, especially as Francophones, given that our histories and destinies are so closely linked. I also pay tribute to all of the Indigenous peoples who live in the region, whether they are from here or elsewhere, whether they are young or old, because they too continue to strive for climate justice and the right to live with dignity and respect according to their knowledge and cultural systems. It's important to recognize the strength and resilience of these First Peoples and to support them where we can. I would also like to take this moment to acknowledge the history of slavery and serfdom in Canada, in order to pay tribute to all of the Black and non-Black people who paid the price in blood to build this country. Even though they have done so much for this country, their stories are so often ignored. We also recognize that today, as yesterday, and as the day before, and the day before that, people have lost their lives or live in inhumane conditions caused by systems of oppression. Many of us have seen loved ones disappear or love people who suffer violence on a daily basis. Many of us are traumatized. Some of us have been wounded because of real or supposed links with countries, cultures, or religions involved in these conflicts. Many of us actively fight against violence and oppression, yet often feel ignored or silenced. And many of us live in fear of what the future may yet bring. I'm going to be quiet for the next minute to give you the opportunity to personalize this territory, this land recognition for yourselves. Thank you for having participated in the land recognition. Thank you very much, Chuck. Good, good morning for people in Western Canada. Good afternoon for those in Eastern Canada. I'm very happy to be able to have this conversation with you. We've been planning this event for a while. I think we started planning in May 2024. So it's been a long time. But that being said, to begin, as you mentioned, my name is Chúk Odenigbo. I am the consulting director of the impact evaluation at Tamarack. I live in Alberta, and I am a Francophone, and I come from a minority language community. And I realized that when I started to work in the environmental sector or in my social connections, I wanted to be able to create some awareness. But then I realized that there was this question of language, and that had an impact of how we were interacting with people, not only with our friends, but also with the government, etc. And I realized that the extent to which that language is a sensitive issue, namely with respect to community engagement. And also, when I started to support NGOs, and especially NGOs that wanted to become more bilingual and who wanted to be more involved in the bilingual community, for example, the city of Ottawa, the city of Montreal, namely cities where there are large English or French-speaking communities. But I was thinking, it's not just translation that you need in order to be able to engage various groups. But there's a whole issue of language and language justice. So we started to ask questions. We live in a country that uses languages that are used a fair amount on the international level. But, so we asked ourselves a questions. Do people still have a difficulty given that there are so many resources? And here specifically, I'm speaking about the Indigenous languages, and namely with respect to our commitments towards all peoples. And I wanted to have this exchange with people who were working in a bilingual community and that are so we have people who are working in the environmental sector. And so I wanted to have people who worked in the engagement in a bilingual community. So I'm very happy to introduce Myriam Ponette, who's working with the La Pêche Coalition for New Green Deal. She's working in the municipality of La Pêche in Quebec. And also, I'd like to welcome Annika Chiasson, who's the executive director of the New Brunswick Environmental Network. And she's working at the provincial level. And also, Julie Donlevy, who's the program manager for the Youth Harbor. And she is working for an NGO at the national level. So welcome, everyone. So I'm going to go right into my first question. And I'm going to begin with Myriam. So Myriam, each of you works with organizations that aim to create environmental or climate societal change. How important do you think it is to do this kind of work in both French and in English? So this is a very general beginning. And Myriam, I'm going to begin with you. So the significance of speaking in both languages, in French and in English, is that what you're asking with respect to our work? This is Chúk. Yes, the importance of being able to do your work in French and in English. This is Myriam. I see it as a question of accessibility, to be able to open the door to more people, not everyone, because some people are more comfortable with other languages other than French and in English, but also to allow a lot more people to benefit, to have access to information and services, namely when services and information are being offered in both languages. This is Chúk. Thank you, Annika. Since the beginning of an organization of New Brunswick Environmental Network, it was clear that we were going to work in both languages. And from the beginning, it was important for us because as a communication network and an organization that was trying to facilitate collaboration at the provincial level, well, we needed to be able to have the participation of everybody in this province, which includes, of course, people who speak both French and English. Otherwise, we would be excluding too many people. Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie. I'm in Montreal. Thank you. And to respond to your question, as Chúk mentioned, the Youth Harbor Project extends to all of the country, and it's important to work in both languages. Yes, because there are a lot of people who are protesting, who want changes to the climate situation. And whether we're talking about projects or programs or reports, we're not only talking about those elements, but also in a Francophone context or in the context of living in Quebec or being in Quebec or living in a Francophone community, there are other fights that need to be led, namely for the climate crisis. So, for example, we have to take into account that the Southern Ontario is more Anglophone, whereas the northern part of Ontario is more Francophone. So there are a lot of climate issues, and that's why it's important to talk in both languages, to be able to communicate in both languages. So in that case, we are more able to meet the Canadian goals, namely with respect to climate justice, because if we only speak English, then we're excluding a lot of people. Thank you, says Chúk. Now, I'm going to launch into an argument that I often hear. But Francophones in Canada all speak English. Why do we need to do something? Why do we need to be bilingual? So what do you do with respect to how do you navigate rather the power relationship between both languages in the areas where you work? Anika, this is not something that I've heard a lot in our area of work. People don't necessarily ask us why we're making an effort to ensure that everything is bilingual. However, in our work, we speak to Francophone communities, and oftentimes we hear that they're not being heard as much when they speak French in a mainly English-speaking meeting. And what is really helpful in this context is to have an organization that's bilingual and that we encourage people to speak in the language of their choice. So why do we make this effort? Well, we want everybody to feel comfortable to express themselves. And I'm a Francophone, but sometimes I'm more comfortable with French. Sometimes I'm more comfortable with English, depending on the situation and on the subject. But we want to make sure that everybody is able to fully participate. So that's why we're making the effort. We don't want to exclude anybody, namely who are facing certain issues, etc., not only because of where people live, but also because of the language that people speak and also because of their culture. Thank you. Merci. Thank you, Julie. I agree with you, Anika. And it's pretty cool because I work with a youth community, and oftentimes we hear bilingual discussions and sort of half French and half English at the same time. And this webinar with interpretation, it shows us that there are a lot of ways that we can do things. It could be through interpretation. It could be completely bilingual. But what I've also seen, and it's a good example, is that once I was at a meeting and we saw that there were Anglophones who wanted to practice their French. So yes, we had interpretation and we had a bilingual space. And maybe the discussion only happened in English, but perhaps that person really wanted to practice their French. So in those type of situations, it can help people be learners. It can help people to be able to mix both languages up. People can make mistakes, but even between two people, it opens the door to be able to change language. As Anika said, sometimes there are subjects that are easier to express in one language or another. So if we only have a unilingual space, that's, for example, only in English, that we're losing an opportunity to share culture or language, because, of course, once again, it really depends on the subject at hand. And Miriam, over to you. Chúk, I think you mentioned it earlier, mostly English. And here I'm talking about any majority language, but mainly English, given that it's a majority language in most of the planet. It's a sort of privilege in line with other types of privileges, for example, race, sexual orientation, etc. And that has its own power dynamic. What I find is that Anglophones are often used to having everything translated into their mother tongue, and they expect to receive information in English because almost anywhere in the world we can get information in English, but it doesn't work in a vice versa perspective. So, for example, I've visited certain communities in Canada, but apart from Quebec, we can't really expect to receive information in French, and we don't have that expectation. And I find that there's an inequity, and it's really a double standard. The fact that we live in a country that is supposed to have two official languages, and it really comes back to a question of how comfortable people feel. So other panelists here have mentioned that it depends how people feel. Do they feel comfortable to be able to speak in another language? There are also certain situations that are inconvenient. For example, when we don't understand everything 100%, it has an impact on the quantity of information that we have access to. It can be as well an issue of safety and security, depending on the type of information that's being communicated or that is not being communicated in people's mother tongues. Incredible. So here's what I would like to ask you. So we're talking about people feeling comfortable. We'd like people to be able to be comfortable in the same space. And to be able to work in a larger community, even if we don't live in the same region. For example, we agree that we need to fight for climate change, not for climate change, but changes to the climate plan. But also, how can we create safe spaces? You spoke about that. I like to talk about safe space. People can be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable if they're not used to being served in their own language. So as Miriam said, when you create a space and when there's a bilingual community, we're able to recognize that we want to respect minority languages, in this case, French, but also create a space for people who are in the majority feel comfortable expressing themselves. And also the whole notion of fighting against injustice. It doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to the other injustices, but uh, we can focus on this one in particular. Because it's part of the notion of solidarity and also part of being able to move to grow collectively together. So I know that there are people, for example, who have added questions in the chat. So now that we spoke about the significance of languages, I have another question as to how we can go ahead. What are some of the actions that we can undertake, especially when we take into consideration different capacities? So we have interpretation, but interpretation is fairly expensive. It's not everybody who has access to this. And the same thing for translation. So you're working in small, medium, larger organizations. So what are the ways that you use to engage people? What are the actions that you can take to make sure that everybody feels comfortable? And even if they don't feel comfortable, how can you adapt? So what are the tools and mechanisms that you can use within your teams, but also outside of your organizations to engage people? And Julie, I'm going to start with you. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. In my work, I realize there are a couple of small challenges. Namely, we need a budget, namely for translation from French to English. But beyond translation, as you mentioned, Chúk, there are internal and external considerations. But for example, see a French speaking member of the team wants to push to have more French, it's not necessarily going to work externally if we want to hire Francophone people. I can say that we have a team that's more bilingual. We have more bilingual capacity. And therefore, it was a better time for us to try to have more engagement. But it's not just the notion of having more Francophone, more Francophones, but also to have a relationship, especially because we're working with young people, but also other partners. So we want a closer relationship. We don't just want to be able to say, for example, 20% of our partners to be Francophones. It's more that an effort. And sometimes it takes time. You can't say, oh, tomorrow we want to be a perfectly bilingual organization. That's not possible if on a day-to-day basis, that's not what's happening. And it's going externally, it's going to be clear that your organization, an organization that has values, that respects to multilingualism. And I said that there are other ways, for example, though other laws or other fights other than climate change, where we have to be inclusive. So those are some of the challenges, but also some of the ways that we can manage the situation. Thank you. Oh, these are important points. Thank you. So to be able to increase the internal bilingual capacity in order to be able to reflect that externally without having to spend money. So Miriam, you work in more of a volunteer organization. Tell us about you. Yes, as Julie mentioned, the internal capacity is extremely important. It's a bit of a vicious circle. We don't have enough bilingual capacity in our team. We don't communicate as much in the other language. So we don't invite Francophones to join the team. So we continue to not have enough capacity within the team because Francophones don't have a sense of belonging or a sense of being included or being welcome. One of the approaches that I really appreciated, and this really is a winning approach, and we haven't used a lot of resources for this, but we led a number of consultations with the community. And we did that in the rural community where I live. There are a lot of English and French speaking people. And it's always hard because the question that often comes back is the time that it takes to translate everything 100% from one language to the other. It can be boring, and sometimes we simply don't have the time to translate everything. So here's what we did. On the PowerPoint, we did a presentation in French, and we invited people to ask questions in the language of their choice. And we had somebody on site who was able to speak with a number of people, but we also provided a paper copy in English of the PowerPoint presentation and of all of the speaking notes as well. The notes, for example, that accompanied each slide. In that way, people had all of the information. Oftentimes, what I see, and I think that it's unfortunate, is that we sort of do a bit in English and a bit in French. And sometimes this has been suggested as a solution. It's fine for me, I'm bilingual, but if you're unilingual, you end up missing about half of the information. So this is an approach that I don't really like. Thank you, Chúk. It's interesting when you talk about going between the French and English. I was thinking about how I appreciate Air Canada. I just want to let you know that they are not a sponsor to this webinar, but oftentimes, you know, when I'm on the plane and I'm listening to music, And then suddenly I think, oh, I missed the announcement, but then I realize that they're going to repeat the same message in the other language. And I think, great, I'm bilingual. I completely understand. Anika. Yes, I agree with what Miriam and Julie said. It really starts internally, and that's what we're doing within our team as well. There are English and French speaking people on our team. So people are able to express themselves in their own language. And sometimes if people miss something, we're able to clarify the situation or repeat a specific piece of information. Externally, we organize a lot of meetings within our network, as you can imagine. So one thing that would be really helpful for us to engage people in both languages is to speak English, French. So generally speaking, there are more Anglophones than Francophones. But also we put the emphasis on the fact that it will be a bilingual meeting. Also, I saw a comment earlier as to how we can have discussions in a separate languages. But another conversation that I had with members about 2 years ago, we had a survey with respect to the engagement of the Francophones and the various networks in New Brunswick. And what came out of that is to basically have meetings in both languages. And people appreciate that, but we also have to give an opportunity for participants to express themselves in their own language. The other thing, at least our written documentation is bilingual. The slides are bilingual and the follow-up notes are in both language. So everything's in both languages. So I find basically that it takes that it ensures really that we're accountable and that we provide the visibility and that remind people that we are trying to function in both languages. This is Chúk. So have a question. I've worked with organizations who want to become bilingual. So what does it mean for you to be bilingual? Because each organization, each level of government has a different answer to that. In New Brunswick, bilingualism is repetition. So there has to be everything in French and English. At the federal level, people can speak in French or in English. For some people, there's sort of a situation where it'll be partly French and partly English. So it allows people to speak in both languages. So it's interesting to ask this question to organizations. Say, for example, let's talk about where we can start. If we had a discussion internally, what should we do? Should it be repetition? Should everything be done in English and in French? Does it mean that there should be bilingual spaces? Does it mean that we are going to customize the situation or the content? So will there be content only in English that's important to Anglophones, or would we have the same situation, for example, for Francophones? So they're very different ways of being bilingual. So we want to be able to ask that question to see what we can do, taking into account the capacity, because the notion of capacity is really important. We have to remember that people can learn French. With all of the staff that we hired, when we've hired unilingual Anglophone staff, every Friday, we provided 8 hours of French lessons. So they were paid their usual salary, but on Friday, their job was to learn French. And their idea was not necessarily for them to become bilingual. because we all know that to become bilingual takes a lot of work and more concrete actions than simply 8 hours of work per week, but rather to develop empathy towards another group, another cultural group, a group that they may not have easily access to. So, for example, for some people, conjugation of verbs is really important, but for other people, less so. But the goal of the lessons was more to say, here's how you can access French language realities. Here are the words that you need to understand, words that will give you access to a new reality. And then afterwards, how they can create that reality, how they can integrate rather that knowledge and that reality into their work, how it can add to innovation. So when people learn another language, it expands your ability to be able to understand other realities and integrate that. So we're at the first levels of learning. That's what happens. But one thing that's really important for Tamarack Institute is to share the concepts that exist in French and that don't exist in English. So we spoke about words, parce qu'en anglais, because in English we'll speak more about travel, whereas other words can be used in French. And for example, in French, there's a word for a never ending trip. So we can talk about a specific trip, but it doesn't really talk to you about the road that we're following in life. So I just wanted to add that to the um, discussion. So I see that there's a question from Marcia. Anika. So I'm going to wait for Marcia to try to clarify her question. But in the meantime, perhaps we can answer to both options. For example, if you are outreaching to bilingual people, are there methods that you have used that have been most successful? Within our network, given that we want to provide help to groups in both languages, our priority is to ensure that all of our external communications is available in both languages, so that we have a weekly newsletter that is sent to all of the members of our group members and our communication as well. We always want to make sure to identify who's bilingual, who's francophone, who's an anglophone, who's unilingual, or in fact, what is their communication, their preference with respect to receiving communications. And that helps us to really be able to engage with specific people. For example, our newsletter. If people indicated that they prefer receiving the newsletter in English, then they will only receive it in English. But if they said that they prefer a bilingual version, then that's what they will receive. So we're trying to adapt to our groups' needs and the members of those groups. Internally, when we've had member groups that are less external, every time we start with the question, what language do we want to work in? Do we want to work bilingually in French or in English, etc.? So that allows us to make sure that we're able to offer the service. So we've just received a clarification. So I think that she's responded to the question. So Julie and Miriam, do you want to respond to that? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. This is Julie. Yes, I can add something to that. To be able to engage people, I think that it's also important to think globally. If we think in If we think, for example, to try to engage the youth, it can be individually. Sometimes for me, engagement can be on an individual basis. So, for example, I might engage with young people who only speak French. And I had a couple of meetings and email exchanges with them to understand what their needs are. And sometimes the people might have a better understanding of written word rather than in the spoken word. So perhaps that person would prefer to receive documentation in writing in English. But also there's a structural component. For example, there are scholarships for people, but there are options there that where people can respond in French or in English or in both languages. That way, it's more available to different people because certain subjects could be answered in a mix of French and English, but also, generally speaking, it's important to focus on the relationship. And generally speaking, you have to think about what the demographics are. If we're talking about new Canadians, we have to understand that there are a lot of immigrants are more francophone. And if we want to be able to speak to them, we need to take that into account. Or, for example, with the First Nations community, some of them speak more English or more French. And to be multilingual, it's important to have a closer relationship with those people so that we're better able to understand their needs. So we've received a very interesting question. Because, as bilingual people, oftentimes we'll come, because we're bilingual people will come and see us and say, oh, can you translate this quickly? But, I have my own job to do as well. Yes, of course, it takes a lot of time, but it's more it takes more time when the team capacity is insufficient. So Chuck, you spoke about your situation. If you're one of the only one of the only people, and I'm not saying that this is the case at Tamarack, but if you're one of the only people who speaks French, that there is that additional work because, you might have to do translation for the group, and that's not fair. It's not reasonable. However, if there are people in the team that are francophone and anglophone and either other languages, if we want to include other languages, then there it's more manageable because my mother tongue is English. And when I try to write in French, it can take me a lot of times. I'm able to do a good job, but if I can have a colleague, a francophone colleague who is able to do it, it will take them 10% of the time that it would take me. It doesn't mean that doesn't represent a certain workload, but it means that we need an additional resource within the organization. But, if it's the right person doing the job, it can save us a lot of time. Anika, Julie, would you like to add something, or shall we move on to another question? Anika, I simply want to say that I understand your situation, Chúk, because that's what happened when I came to the network. And at one point, I had to say to the director, look, I'm spending half of my day looking at other people's written text, and I have other work to do. So yes, again, we do need to have the proper human resource capacity in order to be able to do that work. This is Julie. Yes, I really like the idea that Chúk spoke about, namely that it's important to take more time to become more bilingual. Sometimes I spend more time doing translation if we don't have capacities, and it can be really difficult sometimes. My mother tongue is English as well, but I think that it also takes a lot of time to add the little details in French. For example, sharing music in French or media in French, because generally speaking, there are a lot of French language medium, but elsewhere in Canada and elsewhere in the world, there's so much more English. So if it's possible, for example, to share information about something that you like, naming about a film in French, it can help. It can help people be exposed to that reality and to expose them, to that reality once again. So it's also more of a cultural experience. Yes, we shouldn't see it necessarily as overtime or extra work, but we should see it as helping people to be able to immerse themselves in the other culture. We don't have a lot of time left, says Chúk, and there's a question in the Q&A section. And I invite you to answer this. But I want to answer two questions before we go. So recognizing that we don't have a lot of time, I'd ask you to be efficient. So we've spoken about Indigenous languages, and oftentimes but people, for example, will say, what about this or that? So here's my question. Given that you're working in both languages, in English and in French, so has the fact that you speak more language, has it helped you, for example, working with people who have neither one of those languages in their language combination? And the second question is, in working with NGOs and community organization who want to do more bilingual engagement, well, is there something that you have not yet mentioned and that you would like to communicate to the group today? So that we're going to do that fairly quickly. So Anika, I'm going to start with you, then Miriam, and we'll end off with Judy. Yeah, that's a big question. For me, it's a question of visibility and recognition. The environmental movement will not be possible without the participation of our Indigenous communities. And that's a commitment that we have within our team as well, and that we reflect this as well externally. So even if we don't have the capacity to offer all of our resources in the Indigenous languages of New Brunswick, at least we try to recognize that their presence. I'll give you an example. When I did an engagement session with the Francophone groups, I said that we're having trouble having access to French language resources in New Brunswick, but we have the same problem in some of the indigenous languages. So we want to be able to recognize that those are problems that are bigger and go beyond just the Anglophone or Francophone side of things. And there's a guide that we wrote as to how to organize bilingual meetings. So if people want to go on our website, people will have access to that. In fact, I'll be able to share the link in the chat with respect to this guide to organizing bilingual meetings. Miriam, what I really liked in what Anika and Chuck said in previous questions, in your approaches, it was clear that you really valued the French language. Anika, you were talking about the fact that you wanted to explain over and over to your clients why you're doing what you're doing, the significance of bilingualism. And Chuck, you were talking about the importance of setting aside a day for Anglophones so they can learn French. And it not necessarily in order to become bilingual, but to understand their colleagues and to be able to learn a bit about the French language culture. And I think that's the same situation with other languages, to put energy and to make space for Indigenous languages, and also in the languages of new Canadians. It creates an awareness, and it also ensures that we recognize a value to their participation in our communities, namely the people who speak those languages in our communities. It's fantastic and it's essential. We know that culture and language are completely interdependent. And the fact that Canada tried to erase Indigenous culture, mainly through the residential schools, by taking away Indigenous languages, we have a duty to invest ourselves, to promote those languages, to speak them. I know that it represents a lot of work to translate into 50 languages, but we can still create space to do that, and we can take time to learn those languages and to be respectful and to be sensitive to the needs of each community or each group, each of the groups that we work with. For example, to translate information in the language of the people who are part of our group. So try to include as many languages as possible. Incredible, says Chúk. Julie, yes, I only have a minute, but thank you, Miriam. That was really well spoken. And what I wanted to say is that our fights are very much related. So the fights for the Indigenous people and others people as well, namely for new Canadians. We need to be more inclusive for French or for English. And in being able to exchange, we'll be able to change cultures. Yes, I love that, says Chúk. Finally, in order to be able to bring this to a proper ending, thank you again to our three panelists. Thank you. And when we talk about becoming bilingual, what does it mean? What does bilingualism mean for you and how to implement it? It's really easy to add a third or fourth language. So when you've created space for a second language, it's easy to add a third language because we can say, oh, you know what? We already have the tools to do that. We already have the structures that we need in order to be able to add a third language. So for example, when I'm promoting the significance of becoming bilingual as an NGO, as an organization, or whatever, it's also recognizing that it's much easier to become bilingual in French. But when we understand how we would like to work in another language, it becomes a lot easier to be more successful. So thank you so much, everyone. We could speak about so many other subjects, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time. Jessica, over to you. Thank you, Chúk. Thank you, everyone. So thank you for having attended this webinar with us. It was really interesting. For other events that might be interested and that are associated with this subject, well, not exactly about this subject, with either interpretation into English or with bilingual documentation. So Engage Fest is coming up in a few weeks, and Jamie has shared the information on the screen. And it seems that there's another event coming up using the accessibility matrix. So we will follow up with an email with the information. So thank you. Thank you for having been with us, and see you soon.